Hi, everyone. This lecture is Synthesizing Ideation Findings into a Design. So now we're in the ideation part of our design thinking process. We've worked our way through having empathy for the users to defining the problem and even potentially redefining the problem based on what we learn. And now we're in the ideation phase where we're going to take what we've learned from interviews and begin to build them into a design. And actually, it's not just it's not just the interviews, it's everything that we've learned up to this point, both from secondary research, from interviews, and from other sources. So let's just recap kind of our journey and where we've been in the course so far. So in week one, we really learned that our motivation should be the biggest impact that we can have on the problem. So that's how we should really be evaluating our designs. And we should be able to look up at them side by side and say, well, I think this one's gonna have a big impact. Let's pursue this idea. We've also taken some time to learn about technologies and change processes. And we've learned that they have extraordinary potential to take a real big bite out of our problem. So we have this opportunity now. We have these tools that we can begin to think about incorporating. So I encourage you to really think about design as a playful process and use this time to imagine how you might use technologies, how you might use these processes, to compare lots of different ideas and see really where you want to end up. Now, in week two, we began to develop the questions that we hope to ask our users and experts so that we can both better understand their needs and better understand the problem. And we were trying to do all of this from a beginner's mind and trying to really be a neutral observer in our conversations with those experts to really understand where they're coming from, and then use that to inform all of the things that we've learned in aggregate. In week three, we began to think more deeply about empathy. We defined the problem for maximum impact, and we really looked at ways to think about it, like gravity problems or other kinds of problems. And we also began to think about what does it really mean to design for everyone. Now in week four, this is where some of that synthesis happened, right? We thought about our design criteria. Remember, we really wanted to step back and think, what am I really trying to accomplish with my design? What outcomes do I want? What are the boundary conditions? What are the requirements and constraints? And all of that goes into the design criteria. We talked about utilizing change agents, and we heard a lot about celebrating failure as a way to create a culture where innovation is possible. And lastly, in week five, we played around with design. We tried it for the first time. We employed mindsets and best practices. And we're gonna work more and more with the design template in the coming weeks to really think about what should my design look like and how might I come up with a bunch of different designs. So now it's design time. It is game on. This is Design Lab for Social Innovation. We have the D word. We are ready to go. So remember, always hang on to and come back to this as your driving idea. Design is simply the process of creating something by making motivated choices. And that's key, right? Like we're not doing Jackson Pollocks here. We're not throwing paint on a wall to see if it sticks and getting a random design and going, this is it. What we are really trying to do is create a project that is based on motivated choices, based on all of the things that we've learned so far in this problem. And by this point in your DSWs, you guys have learned a lot. And so you have a lot to draw from. So let's think about how these motivated choices manifest into our design work. So as we've kind of already hit this note a couple times in this talk, these choices should be motivated by the intended impact. And you're going to justify them using your secondary research, interviews, and the techniques and practices that you've studied throughout the course of your social work career or your other careers. And your training, of course, as well. So let's circle back and just talk, what do we mean about this ideation stage? It's obviously, it has the word idea in it, and it's actually idea generation, merged into one word. And that's really what we're trying to do. So in this stage, our goal is to use everything what we've learned, the interviews, the lit reviews, and we want to use that to define the scope of the problem so that we really want to understand, what problem should I select that, if solved, will result in a high impact for our beneficiaries. And so we might play with rescoping. We might look at the problem life cycle and say, you know what, do I want to do triage for opioid addiction, or do I want to try to deal with babies that are born opioid addicted or anywhere through, the whole problem life cycle. And so thinking about impact helps us make some of those tough choices. We want to understand the user of our intervention. We want to develop empathy for them. We want to understand their needs and how they see the problem. We also want to use our experts and people that are, smarter than us to identify gaps and opportunities in the landscape. So we really want to understand where are those possible spaces for innovation? What areas aren't people working on? What areas can I dig deeper into? And then ultimately begin to have conversations that help us identify the design criteria and features. So we've really focused a lot on on the idea of the primary research conversation being about users or experts or problem definition or understanding their needs. And that was to help you focus. But now that you have those interviews on paper, these are the things that you should be looking through them for. Look for those little gems that cover any one of these topics that can ultimately help you design. And obviously the ideation stage finishes in the design process. So, and again, our design template is going to be our tool for doing that easily. So now comes the synthesizing findings part. We've done interviews, and this is actually an example of real interview notes I took for a project. I've obviously changed the names, but you'll note, and you don't have to annotate them quite in this format, I just thought it would be helpful for you to visualize and see it. But I used comments, but I captured things and I began to pull concepts together. So you'll note at one point the expert talks about assessment of human soft skills as a demonstration of that skill. And I note that effective behavior is going to need to include that demonstration. I note that the expert said that soft skills are difficult to analyze and quantify. And I note that that has implications for my assessment or problem evaluation. And just to let you know, soft skills are, unlike technical skills, there are soft interpersonal skills that help us interact. And this is about workplace exploration. So it's a project to help create workplace skills. And then I note some other things about what the expert said about social forms of social reputation. And I note that this might be important to achieving scale in terms of the project being successful or in terms of the kinds of skills that someone needs to acquire. I also note from this interview that companies don't necessarily want to train people for the job. So that's something to keep in mind as I think about implementing. I also highlighted a couple things like it takes 6 to 8 weeks to learn hard technical skills. And I also note that the professor gave me someone to talk with. So I have all of these things now. So this is actually quite a rich interview. I've got several different takeaways. And the expert noted that maybe AI could be used. So I know, hey, maybe we can look into using AI as an opportunity space. So these are all available to me, these notes, and I can now incorporate them into my design criteria. And imagine, of course, that I've got 5, 10, maybe I have even more interviews. So I'll go through all of them. I'll read back to them. I'll see what their key takeaways are. And ultimately, I will be able to kind of build all of that into the final design or into the criteria that I'm thinking about. So let me show you just a little taste of what that looks like. And I know I repeated this slide because I thought it was going to be hard to read. So let me just give you a second to look at it up a little bit zoomed in close, but it actually looks like it's okay on the screen. Okay, so now here's the design criteria and the opportunity space, right? This was one of the versions, and again, you don't have to use this exact version, but notice how some of the things that I extracted from that interview have now shown up on it, right? So I'm saying we could leverage AI. I don't want to require on-the-job training. It must include validation of new assessment for program evaluation. It must include creation and validation of a new assessment for program evaluation. So I'm thinking, some part of my design is going to have to be actually creating a way to assess these soft skills. And that's pretty good, right? Those are some useful things that now make me think about the design space a little differently without actually telling me exactly what to design or how. Now, as I mentioned in the last week, we want to always challenge ourselves to say, can we widen the opportunity space? Can we be giving ourselves much more creative play to work? And so I stepped back and I said, is there a way for me to think about these things differently? And what I did is I took my won't, the require on-the-job training, and I actually said, you know what, maybe it could actually be deployed on the job, provided it doesn't increase the number of hours an employee needs to work. And that thing, while it didn't come out of the interview I just showed you, it could have come out of another interview where maybe what I learned is actually for low-skilled jobs, they're usually hourly, so employers don't want to trigger overtime or extra hours. Now, the other thing that I noted is maybe I don't have to actually create a new assessment. Maybe there's just some requirement that I need to assess program evaluation and assessment in some way. So that's how I've synthesized that interview result and took it into my design criteria and made it part of my design thinking approach. And remember, again, none of this is actually telling me which way to go in and what direction to go in with my design. I know that I have to hold up my design and say, well, this complies with the criteria I've set, or this meets the criteria, but it doesn't actually dictate exactly how I do the design. And that's what makes design criteria so powerful. So now let's go back to our design template, right? This is a tool I made for you. You could design in a lot of different ways, but this to me was one that made sense, that covered a lot of the characteristics that might be in your design. And you'll notice that I've begun to fill it out. And I write, well, this intervention will address the problem of low skills in the entry-level workforce by facilitating training via smartphone, and will ultimately be scaled up through a venture capital startup. So what I'm gonna do, or the idea that I have in response to what I've learned, is maybe I'm going to do a for-profit intervention that's actually going to be some kind of training program that's technology-based, right? And that's actually now getting a lot more specific. And you'll notice that you have a pretty clear idea of what I'm actually going to do as my intervention, and some specifics about it in a very short amount of writing. So I don't have to write pages and pages to tell you what my design or intervention is going to look like. I actually can explain it pretty clearly, and you have a pretty good idea what I'm talking about. Of course, this isn't, by a fully fledged implementation plan, that's for sure. But this is a little bit of a short, easy way of at least understanding what I'm talking about. So then I note that the desired impact, I really want to increase employee retention. And I have a pretty audacious goal. I want to increase it by 30% in 1 year. So I want to see a great reduction in turnover. The nice thing about that as a metric is it's relatively easy to assess, and this isn't data that workforce, that employers usually capture. Now, of course, that's all something that I'm going to learn from my secondary research, from my primary research. This is from a real project that I did, so that's how I know that. But that gives you an idea of how you might begin to talk about these things. And note, I'm really thinking that the user is Jamba Juice and its employees. Jamba Juice is a company I want to work with. Turns out they're very pro workforce training and open to potentially partnering with me, fictitiously, of course. And so obviously I want it to be basically a good solution for Jamba Juice and a good solution for its employees. So I want to deploy it there. So I have to make sure that all of the people at Jamba Juice, even if it's not the employees I'm targeting, that it meets their needs and is able to work for them. Now, on the beneficiary side, it's obviously the Jamba Juice employees that I care about. I want those employees to have great skills, and ultimately Jamba Juice doesn't need to know this, but I want them to move on to better jobs because now they have lots more skills. And actually Jamba Juice kind of does too, sociologically speaking. Anyway, that's the fun of these kind of exponential designs and thinking kind of broad and big, and knowing that the impact that you have today can really become a much greater impact tomorrow. Lastly, I note that there's possible gatekeepers, right? So Jamba Juice management has to approve of this. So not only am I going to need to meet, Jamba Juice managers' needs and its employees' needs, but I need to make sure that I've got their leadership buy-in to run this project. Also, you'll note that I've got an NIH grant that I want to apply for. So I really want this project, however I scope it, to be compliant with their requirements. So this is what I love about design personally, but what I know is really challenging about design in general, which is you have a lot of people that you're trying to make happy. And you're not always going to make all of them happy. And ultimately you have to decide which way to go. And what I love about user-centered design is it says, when in doubt, please go back to your user. Please go back to the person you're trying to serve. Now, I think the reality of doing social innovation and social impact work is you have to think in a very long-sighted way about where the money's coming from, how the grants are being funded, what are the goals that you need to produce. And so you have to balance it a little bit better. We don't always have the luxury of being 100% user-centered, but it definitely helps make sure, it always can be a compass where we say, let's make sure the user isn't in jeopardy in our design. Now, I'm not going to show you the rest of it, but you can imagine now that I've completed this whole template, I've begun to articulate pretty clearly what are the ideas I'm going after and how do I explain my idea in these very simple terms and in terms of these kinds of features and elements. So, okay, so now the fun part is we need to come up with lots of different designs. And if you actually sit down, you can kind of start to churn it out. The more you use this tool, the more comfortable you get. And now I've played around with coming up with lots of ideas. And you know what I realized is maybe I don't even need to do workplace skills. Maybe I want to address low skills in the workplace by actually helping middle schoolers train in entrepreneurship through babysitting programs. Or maybe I want to work on VR training. Or maybe I want to do training for high school students with maybe a kind of fun biotech feature of using some kind of electromagnetic stimulation. Maybe I saw a great study on that and I think that's really cutting edge and want to bring it in. Now, these are, of course, made up ideas, but you get the idea that we can really use this template and this tool to build lots of different potential solutions. And then the fun part becomes we go back and let me stop there. I'll show you in a second how we're going to get to the design criteria, but I missed a step. So one thing I want to just make clear is that what I do when I do this kind of template exercise is I really work my way through the description. I think about all of the different features. Sometimes I don't even do the elevator pitch first unless I'm really clear already on what the idea is. I might write up all of the rest of it and then kind of like writing the introductory paragraph to paper, I'll go back and write the elevator pitch at the end. But what I want you to do and what I'm pushing you to do in this exercise is actually explain why. Why did you make this design choice? It may feel self-evident sometimes. It's kind of obvious. It's like if I'm sick, why did I go to the doctor? Well, I went to the doctor because I'm sick. Pretty clear, pretty straightforward, but sometimes it's not. Or sometimes you have to think for a minute, wait, where did I get that idea from? And the answer is it should be from your training as a social worker. It should be from the interviews that you did. It should be from secondary research that you've done. It might come from informal conversations, but usually you want to justify it in something that's grounded and that you can actually prove or validate. And so you want to begin to list, and you can even you should actually formally cite anything that would normally be cited in a paper, but start to explain. And sometimes you might have something in an interview and say, actually, you know what? I'm not going with that interview. Here's why. I had 2 conflicting interviews. So based on the secondary research, I think I should go with this person. Or, you know what, from one conversation or just instinctively, I think that this might work better. This is why. And so you make your case for any element and why you're targeting them. And all of them should be explainable in just really a few sentences. So now once you've completed your template and you've completed your design canvas, you really want to look at them side by side and say, does my design actually measure up to the criteria? And there's going to be a healthy feedback loop, because what happens is when we design, we begin to see the opportunity space differently too. So in your design, you may say, you know what I thought was a constraint doesn't need to be a constraint anymore. Or, you know what I thought had to be a requirement, maybe there's a way to get around it. And what I want you to do, what I think great innovators do really well, is they grapple with things that they think are the core assumptions. So they grapple with things that they think are certainties and say, do they really need to be assumed? So one of your challenges is looking at the systems that you're working in and saying, you know, do I have to be bound by that system? And the answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no, or the trade-off space may be too great. But I would challenge you, if you're, you know, thinking that you have to deploy in a school and have to meet all of the needs that a school system has, maybe you step and say, does it really? Is there another way I can get that? What if it wasn't cool, but I deployed at summer camps? Or what if I don't have to be HIPAA compliant? What if there's a way to work around that? Or what if my intervention can be commercial and doesn't even have to be therapeutic? Now, obviously, you want to weigh all of those things very carefully. And you want to be, of course, considerate that you're not only meeting your users' needs, but that you're acting ethically, that you're acting according to the principles of your training. But you do want to ask those questions. And even if something is sort of a loose idea, maybe it's a kind of aha, or you're not sure, but you're like, what if I could? Hang on to those what ifs. Hang on to those crazy ideas. Explore them. Come back to them. Maybe it's not the crazy idea, but it will lead you on another really interesting path. So that's the art of design, is really using these tools to dialogue with your ideas and try to think as creatively and expansively as you can about what's possible. So let me give you a couple tips, because I know that not everyone is a gung-ho designer like me. So let me give you some tips, because I have been stuck and it isn't fun. So first off, make design fun. Yes, I know you guys are juggling a lot of stuff and busy, but try to carve out some quiet time and just try to be creative. Imagine you're painting a picture. You know, get out your colored pencils or get out whatever tools are going to make it really fun for you. Post-its, whatever feels good, and apply them to the tool. Now, if you're stuck, here's some things to do. It's okay to walk away for a minute. Now, I'm a compulsive procrastinator, so sometimes I need to even put my walking away in check. But sometimes you do just need to step away, do something else, come back. One technique is to try to just do stream of consciousness. Write in everything that you know, write through it really quick. Don't even give yourself time to think. Just put things in, even if it's doesn't make sense or whatnot. But try to just get as much on paper as you possibly can around the template, and then go back through and see what you've got. If you're really stuck and you're like really kicking it, I would say be silly, even nonsensical. I might try something crazy like writing the template and be like, my intervention will involve aliens coming from Mars, and they're gonna, bring veterinarians to homeless people to help give them tea and cookies. Totally random, doesn't make any sense. Okay. But maybe if I go back, it just gets stuff on paper, it makes me laugh, it kind of relaxes me and reminds me that nothing's set in stone. So that's one value of that. The other thing is you might go back and you might even see something that actually does, as crazy as it is, provoke some interesting idea. Now, the idea of vets for vets, actually, that's not the worst thing I've ever heard. Vets, homeless veterans actually often have pets and animals. Maybe they do need veterinary services. Maybe there's something about that connection that might enable me to make a whole different pathway or intervention around that. Oftentimes creativity is about putting two ideas in front of you. So don't be afraid to read or take in more information or ideas to get the creative juices flowing. And sometimes it might even be doing random things, whether it's colors or different configurations or something, just to try to even get you out of, kind of being locked in or thinking too narrowly about your work. And this happens to all of us because when you live with ideas as long as you have, we begin to get into patterns. We don't always see how to be sort of outside of our own heads when we're thinking about these things. Now, some other tips that I have just from personal experience, these are not necessarily scientifically validated, but I found these things work for me. One is to look at it right before I go to bed. So if I have done some, but I'm stuck on an area, I read it before I go to bed and I sleep on it. Something about how our brains process it at night, I often wake up with better ideas or with greater clarity, or I sit down to write again and it just feels a lot easier. One of my trade secrets is working on things when you are a little tired. So sometimes breaking it out over coffee at 6 a.m. or working on it as the last thing you do before you go to bed at 11. And the reason I think why, and I don't know for sure, but I think it's because our brain sparks and sometimes we make more random connections that way. We're a little tired and we're not always firing exactly in our, our synapses aren't firing exactly in their groove. So when I work on when I'm a little tired, especially if I'm trying to do the creative part of my work, that's when it kind of sparks. And sometimes I get new, interesting ideas that I get really jazzed about. Usually then it's also good to sleep on it. Make sure if you're as jazzed in the morning as you are that night, but definitely write it down. Again, as I kind of gave a tip earlier, don't necessarily work through the template or the exercise in a linear way. It's okay to hop around. You can start with the hardest parts first. You can start with all the things that you know. You can do the executive summary, elevator pitch part at the end. So whatever you need to do to kind of work on it and fill it out and keep things moving, that's how you should approach it. I definitely do the justification after the design for the most part. So I really focus on the design part, and then I check back in and kind of look back at everything and go, well, why do I think that way? Do I have my argument in place? That might not always happen. Like sometimes you're like, oh yeah, I wanted to incorporate that theory. So you write both down, but don't feel like you have to do the justification at the same time if it's not coming to you. You can always come see me or your professor. Sometimes we can ask questions or have a way of helping you talk through things that will get you unstuck. So don't be afraid if you are stuck, especially if you're stuck for more than 24 hours or a couple days, to come see us and chat. We are moving quickly in this course, so it's important that you phone a friend when you need one. And just lastly, I would say hang in there and remember that getting stuck can be part of the process. I often find that for me, even though, and it's horrible no matter how much I know this to be true, but I often find that like the darkest moment really is before the dawn. That sometimes when I feel really stuck and really dug in is when I have the big aha moment. So I think it might be that way for you as well. I hope you have a lot of fun designing, and good luck. And we're here if you need us, but I'm really excited to see all of the great ideas that you come up with. Have a good night.